Hey everyone! Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Today's episode is one I'm really excited to get into since we'll be taking a look at one of my favorite women to ever exist. And that woman's name is Zora Neale Hurston. She isn't the first figure that comes to mind for most people when they think of the civil rights era, which is why I believe it's so important to talk about her, honor her, and let people know the real importance of someone like her. So, without further ado, let's get into some history. So, Zora Neale Hurston was actually a very interesting figure, and she was even more interesting to learn about. I found out the more I researched and uncovered about Hurston, the more hooked I was on figuring her out, I guess you could say. And I bet most of the few historians who have studied her can agree. So, Hurston was raised, not born, in Eatonville, a purely Negro town in Florida. She moved there as a very young child, which describes why Hurston has said she was born there in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. But technically, she wasn't. Now, it's really important to note that Eatonville was not just any all-black southern town. Eatonville was the first nationally recognized all-black town, which actually was built and run by black people themselves. This means that unlike any other purely black towns, this one was up to par in terms of infrastructure and government with wealthy white towns at the time. This was literally unheard of for Hurston's time, which was the early 1900s. Now, growing up in Eatonville was a time in Hurston's life I believe to be the most important for two reasons. One, it completely shaped her beliefs and would kind of indirectly determine what kind of author and person Hurston would turn out to be. If Hurston was never raised in an environment like Eatonville, where she was exposed to wealthy black people, black entrepreneurs and business owners, and even her dad being mayor, she never would have developed the connotation that black people can be anything they wish and that race is not a setback or a burden to them, or anyone for that matter. Two, she references Eatonville so much in her work. In her most famous book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Hurston actually uses Eatonville as a setting for her characters and uses her knowledge on rural and black folklore / dialect in the dialogue that the characters use. Hurston's southern black roots can be found in all of her work if you look for it. Hurston's upbringing in her hometown did shape her as an individual and as well as a writer, but it was not wholly responsible for all she would accomplish in life. A lot of her success came from within her, as opposed to the environment surrounding her. Despite her rather lucky circumstances growing up, Hurston often felt isolated and different from other children growing around her. Her separation from most people around her was another defining characteristic of Hurston, but in my opinion, her individualism was what made her all the more stronger and actually contributed greatly to her success. So, now that we have a good background on Hurston's life, we can explore her philosophy itself. As I mentioned before, Hurston had core beliefs within her that gave her the vastly different perspective on the black identity and black literature. Other black writers during her time would really tend to focus on struggle, 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 and their work would reflect that. It's honestly understandable, though, with how much blacks had to endure socially, economically, and more, it was their right to voice their oppression with the power of literature. The problem was, struggle had become synonymous with black expression, especially during the civil rights era. In hindsight, struggle was their loudest voice. But Hurston, now being thrown into this type of environment that was so different from Eatonville, never changed her views according to where she was. She remained true to her roots and philosophy, which was that black struggle certainly did exist, but struggle was not where expression should wholly reside. I believe this is why it is so important to honor Hurston and her ideas. She said what many people were too wrapped up in their own opinions to even acknowledge. There were even people who criticized her for her own opinions. Richard Wright, for example, asserted that Hurston's work carried no theme, no message, and no thought, because her work did not solely restrict black characters to race-related themes and struggles, and they instead had lives, hopes, and dreams that normal characters do. People saw it as a crime for black authors to not use their voices for the sole purpose of racial progression during a time where they believed it was needed the most. Wright is only one of many people who had little respect for Hurston as a writer. People today even have opinions similar to Wright, which means that there are people out there that believe Zora Neale Hurston does not deserve to be memorialized. I think that these people fail to see that people like Hurston are people that we need most in society. It is people like Hurston that remind us of who we are as individuals aside from our loudest impression, aside from America's impression, which leads me to my memorial of Hurston. I think it is quite obvious now why I chose to memorialize Hurston. Aside from her being an amazing person who brought light and new ideas wherever she set foot, Hurston changed the conversation for Black Americans and urged them to express themselves for themselves and no one else. For my memorial, I chose to honor Hurston through a painting. I put much thought into this painting, down to the smallest details. It was also super fun to take my knowledge of Hurston and find cool ways to symbolize her life while also telling a coherent story. My painting was inspired by a popular painting style called night and day. This style is a nature-like landscape where the canvas is split in half. One side represents day, and the other side represents night. And I thought this style would be perfect for my idea. In my painting, you can see how one side shows a landscape of a starry night with the full moon and stars, and the other shows the sun setting and casting a beautiful golden hue on the ground below it with some stars in the sky twinkling. The starry night side represents Hurston's childhood, and the sunset side represents Hurston's journey as an adult. I thought of doing the starry night side as her childhood because of a quote in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. Her quote reads, "Mama exhorted her children at every opportunity to jump at the sun. We might not land on the sun, but at least we would get off the ground." And I thought I could mirror this through a silhouette of young Hurston looking up at the stars in reference to her mom's wise words, that even if she couldn't reach the moon, at worst she would land on the stars. The sunset side representing Hurston's adult life is perhaps my favorite symbolization in the whole painting. The sunset represents the sun setting on a dark time for African Americans during the early 1900s because it was around that time that Hurston was entering adulthood, where the Harlem Renaissance would begin and start a new era for Black joy and pride. The painting shows a silhouette of adult Hurston looking off towards the sunset, but the viewer cannot see her expression. These two silhouettes are both not facing the viewer nor each other. The two have a golden string wrapped around their fingers and that bridges the border to each other's sides. This string represents how Hurston's childhood was always irrevocably connected to who she became as an adult. The tree in the middle of the canvas is also a constant in the painting, not constricted to any side. The tree is shown to be on a sole island in the middle of the painting, with roots ingrained into the ground. The lonely island itself also represents Hurston, who said she always felt like somewhat of an outcast and she felt isolated from those around her. She carried these feelings with her into adult life, which is why both her child and adult version are on the island. The tree is a southern magnolia tree, which obviously represents Hurston's southern heritage. The roots hint at Hurston's own roots to who she is and her upbringing in the South. You can also see how there are small black rocks bordering the entire island, which brings me to another inspiration of this entire painting, a quote from Hurston. This quote reads, "I do not always feel colored. Even now I often achieve the unconscious zora of Eatonville before the Higuera. I often feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. For instance, at Bernard. Beside the waters of the Hudson, I feel my race. Among the thousand white persons, I am a dark rock surged upon and overswept, but through it all, I remain myself. When covered by the waters, I am, and the ebb but reveals me again." I used this quote to symbolize Hurston because I thought that it really encapsulates who she is as a person as a whole. So I thought I would base my entire painting on that specific quote. All right, friends, that will be the end of my podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning about Zora Neale Hurston and getting a background on who she was as a person and how she impacted conversations surrounding the Black identity. Have a great day, guys. See you in the next episode. Bye.